you enjoy yesterday? Sorry it was quite a long day. In fact, today's also going to be quite a long one. I promise you, as we get into the course a bit later on, the days do get a bit shorter, but so much to learn right now. What I tried to do yesterday was to convey the message that it's not your fault that you're overweight, but it's the hormones and not calories that are important. Your hormones, not about counting calories or anything complicated like that. What I'd like you to do right now, and from today onwards, is always write down a summary of what you learnt the day before. I'm going to give you a few suggestions right now, but you don't have to use them. And I won't normally give you suggestions or prompts, but just so you get the idea. I'd like you to write down a summary of yesterday, something like you might think that the most important thing was that you learnt that it's not your fault that you're overweight. Or you might want to write down that it's not calories, but hormones that are most important. Or that you must follow a human diet and eat real food. Whatever you want to write down, it's up to you, because whatever you felt you learnt is really, it's all about you. This whole program is about you and what you're learning. But writing down a summary is a great way of concreting the points. And there's no wrong answers. There's no tests or anything at the end. But everything I'd like you to summarize that you learn is going to really help you in the future. Now today we're going to divide it into 3 sections, and it's also, like I say, going to be a bit of a long day. You might want to break it into a couple of different sessions if you like, and that's certainly what others have done when we have a day like today with specific topics. We're first going to start today with looking at how we screwed up the history of food. Then we're going to actually have a look for the first time at all that food that you're eating. What does it break down into inside the body? And then a topic that so many people really enjoy, we're going to look at the difference between happiness and pleasure, because they actually are very different indeed. By the way, you're already doing brilliantly. The fact that you signed up for this course, the fact that you've got through to day 2 tells me that you're committed, and I promise you in return that you will lose that weight. As long as you keep interacting and using your journals, I promise you that you will lose that weight, and I'm so proud of you for getting this far already. That extra weight that you've been lugging around is going to start to disappear soon, and I promise. You're in fact already slender. It's just that your hormones have forced you to overeat for such a long time, and you probably haven't realized it yet, but you've already started to rewire the software in your brain. That software that controls all of your hormones. It started already. You're excited? Because I'm excited to share this with you. Like I said, let's start with a brief history of how, unintentionally I guess, governments have completely screwed up the advice that they provide us about what we should be eating. Now you might think that governments don't actually give us advice about what to eat. And I can understand that, because that's what I thought for so many years. However, governments advise our schools, our hospitals, our doctors. And should you ever visit a doctor, any advice that they give you about the food that you should be eating will most likely be based on the government's guidelines, which today are suddenly so inaccurate that I believe these guidelines are guilty of driving most of the chronic illness that we see in our country. So this is the Eat Well guidelines, the Eat Well plate. And as far as I'm concerned, and virtually all of the experts you're going to hear from over the next few weeks, it's a completely unhealthy guideline for the vast majority of people in the UK. And we believe that it is these very guidelines that's driving obesity across the UK. So here we go. Here's the story of how we got to these guidelines, these ridiculous guidelines. The story begins back in 1862, when at the age of 66, a Mr. William Banting, who was overweight. And by the way, back then they didn't call it overweight, they called it corpulence for somebody that was sort of fat or obese. And Banting considered himself at the very top of the scale of corpulence. At just 5'5", he weighed in at over 200 pounds, which back in the late 1800s, Banting certainly looked out of place. I guess he probably wouldn't if he walked down a high street today. After a very successful business career, Banting could no longer even tie up his shoelaces. Bending over was almost impossible, and he was constantly in considerable pain. He didn't consider himself as lazy. In fact, he was extremely active and daily went rowing and exercised. Yet the more he exercised, the more weight he seemed to pile on. He tried cutting back on his calories, which failed and left him constantly exhausted. Banting tried other activities like hiking and riding horseback, but the more he tried, the more his weight increased. Sound familiar? He consulted the very best doctors across the country, but the more he tried, the more his weight kept going up. Luckily for Banting though, eventually he met a surgeon named William Harvey, who had just weeks before attended a conference in Paris where he heard from a diabetes specialist. His name was Claude Barnard. Now Claude explained to all the listeners that if farmers were feeding animals with starches and sugars to fatten them up for sale, it was very logical to assume that the same would be happening to humans. And he advocated a diet without sugar and starch. Back in the UK, Harvey prescribed this regime to Banting, who began his new diet in August 1862. He avoided all foods containing starch, including breads, beers, potatoes and sweets, all of which in the past he had taken a liking to. Despite still drinking a few glasses of wine each evening, Banting lost 35 pounds, and by the following May, he had lost 50 pounds. He wrote, "I've never felt better in health, but now for the last 26 years, my other body ailments have become a mere matter of history." Just as I was fat and furious, hence the name of my health book that I wrote. And by the way, you don't need to rush out and buy a copy, because I'm going to be sending you a copy of Fat and Furious free of charge towards the end of this course. Banting was furious too, and he published a 16-page booklet called Letter on Corpulence addressed to the public. This is regarded by many people as the first diet book in the history of our species. It sold worldwide, including Germany, America, Austria and France. And according to the British Medical Journal, the Emperor of France is trying the Banting system and is said to have already profited greatly thereby. Within less than a year, Banting had even entered the English language as a verb meaning to diet. One British newspaper on the very front page said, "If he is gouty, obese and nervous, we strongly recommend him to Bant." It appears, however, that Banting's book was not the first. And in fact, in 1825, French author Brillat Savarin wrote a book called The Physiology of Food, in which he stated that he could, get ready for this, "I can easily identify the cause of obesity after 30 years of talking with fat individuals who all proclaim the joy of bread, rice and potatoes." He added that the effects of this intake were exasperated when sugar was consumed as well. However, it was the Banting diet that caught the imagination of our nation, and variations of it were known as ways to reduce obesity, all the way from the mid-1800s to the 1950s. All diets within this period pretty much focused on avoiding breads and anything else made with flour, cereals, potatoes, pretty much anything with carbohydrates or sugar. For almost 90 years, people believed that to live healthily and to reduce weight, all diets should focus on eating as much as you like of meat, fish, poultry, green vegetables, eggs, cheese, and certain fruits. Here are a few quotes from these books. "Carbohydrates carry an inherent quality that makes them uniquely fattening. Carbohydrates induce a continued sensation of hunger, more specifically a hunger for more carbohydrates. Carbohydrates seem to induce less satiation, fullness per calories consumed." By the way, I added those 3 quotes to your What I Learned Today. Sorry about that. I'll try not to do it again in future. I did it because they are crucial comments. Even if you don't yet fully understand what a carbohydrate is, you're going to find out very shortly. In 1959, a book written by Dr. Davidson called Human Nutrition and Dietitians, he wrote, "The intake of food rich in carbohydrates should be systematically reduced, since overindulgence in such food is the most common cause of obesity." For over a century, reducing carbohydrate intake was common wisdom and viewed as the only way known to lose weight. And it was, in fact, 100% correct. Now, a Dr. Jason Fung, who wrote The Obesity Code and The Diabetes Code, great author, great doctor, and in fact you're going to hear quite a lot from him throughout the reset. He wrote, and pick my glasses up because my eyesight, because of all the bad food I've eaten over years, isn't what it should be. He wrote, for a century, diets low in refined carbohydrates were accepted as treatment for obesity. By the 1950s, it was standard advice. If you were to ask your grandparents what caused obesity, they would not talk about calories. Instead, they would tell you to stop eating sugary and starchy foods. Common sense and empirical observation served to confirm the truth. Nutritional experts and government opinions were not needed. So very, very interesting that all the way through, up until the mid-50s, there was only one thing that people believed caused obesity, and that was carbohydrates. So what went wrong? Well, on Friday the 23rd of September, back in 1955, an event happened that would shape our diet for the next 65 years. Right from that day, right all the way till today. And that was President Eisenhower in the States, after a day of golf, retired to bed. And at first it appeared that he had got indigestion. Throughout the night, his pain got worse, and eventually he got admitted to hospital, where it was discovered that he had had a heart attack. For 6 weeks, there were twice daily press conferences to keep the public up to date on the health and the recovery of their president. Now, by the time his health had returned, Americans, scratching for an answer to what had caused the president's heart attack, had been warned to cut both cholesterol and fat from their diet. Nobody was made aware of the fact, though, that the president actually had a very low cholesterol before his heart attack. Even though Eisenhower was only slightly overweight, after his heart attack, he was constantly on a diet, eating very little fat and trying almost obsessively to lower his cholesterol at the advice of his doctors. His food was prepared for him with either soybean oil or a brand new polyunsaturated margarine, which first appeared on the supermarket shelves in 1958. It was hailed as a nutritional alternative to real butter, and it was great apparently because it was low in cholesterol. But the more his experts messed with his diet, the more frustrated he became, and the more weight he started to put on. Keeping him on a low-fat diet, the president's weight slowly kept increasing. Now let's be clear, Eisenhower was putting on weight, increasing his cholesterol by following the advice of his doctors, who were convinced that he should avoid eating fat and anything that had cholesterol in it. Then comes along an American scientist, Ancel Keys, with some very dodgy, questionable, debatable research. And he recommends the very same low-fat, low-cholesterol diet that the president had been losing his battle with his weight for the past 5 years. Ancel managed to get his story on the front cover of Time magazine. And just 2 weeks later, the American Heart Association, after several meetings with the very forceful Keys, endorsed his idea of the low-fat, low-cholesterol diet as a way of preventing heart disease. Not only was Keys very forceful, in fact, even his closest friends said at times he was a very big bully. I personally don't believe that Keys deliberately lied in his research, but he felt so strongly about his hypothesis that he had kept cutting and cutting and cutting his research down until he got the results he desired. Let me tell you actually a little story about Derren Brown. You've probably seen Derren Brown, the magician. In one of his TV programs years ago, he flipped a coin and it landed on heads, and he flicked it again, it landed on heads. And eventually he clicked it, and 10 times in a row it landed on heads. Now, if you do the maths, that's kind of almost impossible. But Derren Brown said, totally legit, the cameras were rolling the whole time, there was no cheating, the coins weren't weighted, we didn't stop the recording. And it was in fact genuine. He had flicked the coin and it landed heads 10 times in a row. Later that year, he revealed how he did it. He actually had the cameras running for 11 hours before he managed once to get it to do it 10 times in a row. I'll come back to that in a moment. Ansel Keys, he'd traveled the world accumulating data on diets of people in 22 countries. But he only published the results of those from 7 countries, which he argued proved his hypothesis. It was actually called the 7 Countries Study. Now, I remember personally in my late 30s being told not to eat egg yolks because my cholesterol was sky high. And all of that advice, if you track it back, originates from Ansel Keys with his Derren Brown style research. The crazy thing is, today we now understand that eating food high in cholesterol does not elevate cholesterol levels, and even more importantly, elevated cholesterol, according to many leading doctors, several of whom you're going to hear from within these 3 sets, believe has very little to do with heart disease. In fact, in recent clinical studies of men over the age of 50, the bracket I'm in, said that those with a lower LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, actually had a shorter life expectancy. So this whole thing around cholesterol at the moment is very much up in the air, and you're going to hear a lot about cholesterol throughout your 49 days on this course. But if you're currently obsessing about it, if you're currently being told that you've got an elevated cholesterol, it might not be the end of the world. Anyway, back to our story. The story of how we screwed up the food in our country. Back in 1962, Keys was questioned about how the Maasai of Kenya, who lived off milk and blood and red meat, had a very high cholesterol diet, according to what they thought back then, and yet their cholesterol was very low. Now, Keys turned around and said, it's just genetics. He then himself studied the Samburu tribe and found similar results. Again, he put it down to genetics. That said, when tribespeople moved out of the bush, out of the savannah, into Nairobi, the capital, and started to eat the westernized diet, our diet, their cholesterol went up. And once again, this kind of disproves Ansel's theory, but he kept saying genetics, when of course it can't be genetics if the same people then move into a city and then their cholesterol goes up. Now, I personally spent time with both the Samburu and the Maasai and tribes throughout Kenya. I've lived with tribes in Tanzania for many, many weeks on end. And I can tell you right now, they have diets that are extremely high in fat, and yet it doesn't seem to cause them any problems at all. They're all lean and healthy. Now, Eisenhower sadly died of a heart attack in 1969 at the age of 78. And of course, at the time, he was following Keys' diet. But sadly, by then, his hypothesis was taken as gospel across America. By then, people had started to blame saturated fat and cholesterol for heart disease, and therefore announced that the low-carb diet, the diet that had worked for people to beat obesity for over 100 years since the 1850s, they said, was nothing more than a dangerous fad, and people needed to increase carbohydrates and reduce saturated fat. Fat, the new dietary villain, was now deemed fattening, a previous unknown concept to mankind. Oh, and by the way, as fat normally comes with a big chunk of protein, the new advice also meant cutting down on protein. That, my friend, only leaves one thing to eat, and that is carbohydrates. Now, here's an interesting thought that only came to me the other day. The crazy thing is, all of our country's dietary guidelines were never really initially about helping people lose weight or beat obesity. What they were really about was preventing heart disease. Now, in 1977 in the UK, we introduced, for the first time in history, food guidelines. We call them now the Eat Well plate. These guidelines were literally cut and pasted from guidelines in America. And in fact, the entire modern world did exactly the same. And just as it did in America, this began, or should I say was the catalyst for the rapid rise of obesity in our country. As Winston Churchill once said, you can trust America to do the right thing, but only after it's tried everything else. These guidelines in America and the UK were compiled off the inaccurate, the misleading, even fraudulent research carried out by Ansel Keys and his team. Since then, since we've had these guidelines, The cases of diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, depression, obesity, and many more have all gone through the roof. So much so that the average adult in UK today weighs 2 stone heavier, that's about 16 kg, than the year before the guidelines were introduced. Sadly, in light of how hideously wrong these guidelines are, guidelines that are making people ill, guidelines that our schools, our hospitals, our armed forces all follow to feed their students, their patients and the military. Even though anyone with an ounce of common sense would see that they are so utterly wrong, they are still in place, unedited, unaltered, and not updated at all. They have to change. And in fact, at some point, please, during the reset that you're on now, if you could go to www.primalliving.com, and down the bottom of the website, I have a lobbying section, and we are trying to lobby government to address the imbalance of the Eat Well guidelines. This current Eat Well guideline drives me mad. It makes me furious, because my poor dad, who injects himself every day because he's a diabetic type 2, he's still being told by his GP that he can eat a balanced diet. Even though today, it has in numerous clinical studies been proven, beyond doubt, that the saturated fat that we eat does not cause heart disease. Even though it is proven that carbohydrates drive insulin, and too much insulin drives diabetes, and can be linked to virtually all metabolic diseases, including the cancers, obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, Alzheimer's, and more. It is still sadly saturated fat that is still portrayed as the bad guy. And do you want to know why? Because the demonizing of saturated fat and the endorsement of carbohydrates helps drive huge profits for the packaged food companies and the fast food chains. Now I want to take you and show you a small film from the brilliant cardiologist, Dr. Aseem Malhotra.
Why I believe that the dietary guidelines are a root cause of the whole obesity and type 2 diabetes epidemic is based upon this flawed hypothesis coming from the 1960s and 1970s that eating fat, and specifically saturated fat, caused heart disease. And that came from an American scientist called Ansel Keys, and he did something called the 7-country study, where he found a correlation with people eating fat with cholesterol and then heart disease. But the correlation wasn't very strong. It wasn't a high quality study. He seemed to be selective. We don't know why. There were 16 countries he could have chosen. He only chose 7. If he'd chosen all 16, the correlation would have been even weaker. And we wanted to re-examine as a result of his research, he was basically the most influential man in changing dietary guidelines in 1977 in the USA and 1983 in the UK. And those dietary guidelines then basically said we should consume less than 30% of all our calories from fat and less than 10% from saturated fat. The food industry came on the back of this and then suddenly started promoting and marketing low-fat foods which had added sugar. You take the fat out, it doesn't taste as good, you have to replace it with something you add sugar. And now when we reflect on the evidence and I look at all of that myself, one, saturated fat does not cause heart disease. That's a complete myth. It's complete nonsense.
And this is coming from not just a GP, but a cardiologist.
Yeah.
You firmly believe, and you've operated on people, and you're talking the heart the whole time, that it's not saturated fat.
It isn't saturated fat. And we're talking about foods like butter, cheese, red meat. And I've analysed that and published on that research and looked at the evidence in its totality. I've not cherry-picked things. Yep. What does it tell us? It tells us there's really no link at all with death rates, with type 2 diabetes, with stroke, with heart disease, with heart attacks. Even if you're a heart attack patient and you reduce saturated fat, it doesn't have any benefit for you. So in all those groups, it's really the very least should not be anywhere close to being a focus of reduction of what you should be eating. And as a result, we've increased our consumption of carbs, particularly low quality carbs. So I'm not talking about whole fruit and vegetables. I'm talking about, too much bread, pasta, rice, potatoes.
That 1/3 of the Eat Well guideline, Eat Well plate that's in front of us, that the government still peddle as a healthy option, where you've got You got cereals, potatoes, breads, bagels, rice, spaghetti, pasta, all the things that we know are highly processed these days.
Exactly, and it's not just that. They say this should be the base of your diet. This has been the guidelines in the base of your diet. You should be getting this as the base of your diet and then add anything else on top of it. And basically what you're getting is foods that are relatively poor in nutrition combined with being very starchy and high in glucose.
Yeah.
The problems we're dealing with are related to too much glucose. Type 2 diabetes is a problem of carbohydrate intolerance related to too much glucose over time that affects, your body's ability to metabolize it. 50% of high blood pressure is again related to, I'll use a term called insulin resistance, but in layman's terms, I would describe that as having excess body fat, really related to diets that are high in starch and sugar, basically.
Here's a question. Hypothetically, if you ran a country, if you was the president, let's call this country America, and your top 3 crops that you grew were soy, corn, and wheat, what diet would you be recommending? Exactly. It's all about money and not health. I want to now introduce for the first time on the course a brilliant investigative journalist called Nina Teicholz. She wrote a brilliant book called The Big Fat Surprise, and here's what Nina has to say on this subject.
But they did hundreds of millions of dollars worth of these huge nutrition studies, these big trials, the rigorous science you're supposed to do, and every time they finished them, they found out the diet doesn't work. Cutting out fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol didn't work. It didn't spare people heart disease. The more the men lowered their cholesterol in the biggest ever experiment test of Ansel-Keys' hypothesis, the more the men lowered the cholesterol, the more likely they were to have a heart attack. So it's like everything came out wrong, and the people in our health institutions just couldn't handle it. They were, this is putting it sort of in simpleton's words, but they just couldn't believe it was true. They were like, there must be something wrong, we did it wrong, we have to do it again. They didn't publish their studies, they didn't publish their results. We found things in basements at the National Institutes of Health that hadn't been published saying, actually saturated fats have no effect on heart disease at all. So we did all these rigorous studies and they were all ignored or excluded and never looked at. And so part of our work today, now with my not-for-profit, is like saying you must look at these studies that were done. Everybody's saying we need more money for nutrition studies. We need more money. We don't know what to tell people. We don't have any data. Well, actually, we did do all these huge trials, but we ignored them. We stuffed them. We didn't publish them. So.
Can I just summarize that opinion then? So what you're saying is there was lots of studies done to see whether fat was the bad guy, to see if cholesterol was the bad guy, but they'd already come up with that hypothesis, and that's what they wanted to stay with. In fact, I think it was Tim Noakes or somebody said, it's hard for somebody to change their opinion when their salary depends on it. So we're saying fat's bad, we're saying cholesterol's bad, so let's go and do a load of research to prove our point. But all that research they did, and they spent millions, and this isn't just one piece of research, wasn't it? There were numerous researches over the years, and
all over
the world, and every time they did that study, it proved completely the opposite to the advice they were given. So it was, I heard one, I think might have been in your book, was buried in somebody's garage that they found 20 years later when they were clearing out. And every time they did the research, it just said, there is nothing wrong with saturated fat. There's nothing wrong with, you can't really link cholesterol and heart disease. And that's kind of what you uncovered as an investigative journalist through all your studies. Is that, have I got that right? Or?
That is correct. So yes, but the researchers and policymakers, that by this point it had already become sort of the policy of the American Heart Association, then became the policy of the government, and they were unable to reverse out of their policies.
Yeah.
You're seen as being weak. You can't, there's so much cognitive dissonance in your mind, you can't believe you might have been wrong. You don't want to be seen as flip-flopping on the public. That's not good for the trust of your institution. So all kinds of reasons. And the food industry's invested in your policy at this point. And so there's all sorts of reasons why you can't reverse out of your policy.
Yeah.
But our first challenge really is just to say, we may not know what the ideal diet is, but we know that the advice that we're currently giving has been tested and shown not to work. So let's at least roll back the things that we know are wrong.
Yeah.
Can we at least just step away from the things that we know are wrong and were tested and they just have not been shown to be true? So and that means, and countries have already done this quite a bit, which is to drop the caps on cholesterol. The whole reason that, people have been avoiding egg yolks and shellfish and for years, decades really, that those caps have been dropped because the evidence really was never there.
Yep.
They tested, not found guilty. So, it's like if you send an innocent person to jail, and then you get the DNA test back and you're like, you know what, you can get out of jail now. Same thing for saturated fats. Tested, not guilty, should be let out of jail. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's now been, since my book, and also the work of Gary Taubes, who also talked about these sort of hidden, buried, ignored studies, there have now been more than 17 teams, independent teams of scientists from all over the world who've looked at those clinical trials, again, the most rigorous kind of data, and done what's called a systematic review of them, and found no effect of saturated fats on heart disease.
Powerful stuff, hey? Look at that, a direct correlation. Okay, so Banting recommended low carbs, then Ancel Keys recommended kind of like the complete opposite. Then we have these guidelines that recommend we eat loads of carbohydrates. But at the end of the day, I keep talking carbohydrates, fat and protein. What is that all about? Aren't all calories equal? I mean, what's the difference between 1,000 calories of bread or broccoli, or the difference between 1,000 calories of cake or carrots? Well, there is a difference. And that's what you're going to learn throughout this reset. And in fact, here's the first bit of crucial information you need to learn about food. And I kind of apologize if you know of this stuff already, and if you do know it already, but it's always good to recap, isn't it, hey? So, I always say, it's not about calories in or calories out. It really is about understanding the effect of different macronutrients on your hormones. You see, everything that lives, whether that be a tree or a human, a dog or a strawberry, is made of the same three basic ingredients. It's made of fat, which breaks down into fatty acids in the body. It's made of protein, which breaks down into amino acids, or it's made of carbohydrates, which pretty much are nothing more than just dressed up sugar. Fat, carbohydrates, and protein are the three macronutrients, and the word macronutrients, by the way, derived from Greek, macro meaning large, that either on their own or a combination of them make up 99% of all the food that you eat. The human body needs both fat and protein to survive and flourish. But contrary to popular belief and the government guidelines, not a single ounce of carbohydrate is necessary to sustain human life. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Everything we eat, no matter what it looks like, its texture, its taste, it's all broken down in our gut into one of these three components. Later in the reset, you'll learn about micronutrients, which are all the other foodstuffs, such as minerals, vitamins, and phytonutrients. But they only make up 1%. Literally 99% of all the volume of everything you eat today and in the future is made up of just that: fat, carbohydrate, and protein. And while there are just three macronutrients, again, carbohydrates, fat and protein, natural whole foods, when they're natural, they only contain a combination of two. If the food or the drink that you're consuming is derived of something that once had a face on it, so an animal or a fish, then it's made of just fat and protein. If what you're eating once came out of the ground, so it didn't have a face on it, a plant, let's say, that's made up of just protein and carbohydrates. Nothing in the natural world is made up of all three. Well, I say nothing. There's a few exceptions. Milk has all three of them in there, and some nuts and some seeds have all three. But with those exceptions, and if you think about nuts, by the way, if you think about milk, what are they there for? They're there to fatten you up. Nuts with a squirrel going into hibernation, milk as breast milk for infants. But with those two exceptions, everything you eat is only ever made of two of them together. Now, why do I mention that right now? And by the way, there's a few things that just have one in. So for example, table sugar is just carbohydrates, although table sugar really isn't a food, it's a poison, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And of course, there are some oils like olive oil and coconut oil that are just oil, which is another word for fat. But with those exceptions, everything is, if it had a face on it, it was only made of protein and fat. If it didn't have a face on it, it was a plant, just carbohydrates and protein. But what's my point, and why is this so important? Why am I laboring it? Because if you buy food that has a label on it, that means it's been engineered by some big food company, it almost always has, ready for this, fat and carbohydrates in that product. You don't get them in nature, but when you get them in the packaged foods, they make you put on weight. It's an unnatural combination that you will see time and time again in packaged food. Trust me, if the food you're eating has a label on it, it has been manufactured and designed for overeating and addiction, and it has both fat and carbohydrates together. I want to put it another way, just in case you're struggling to get this concept, because I keep saying, don't I, it's not about calories, it's not about calories. So calories from fat, calories from protein, calories from carbohydrate, they're all different. They all trigger different hormones in the body. And I keep saying it's about hormones and not about calories. Another way to look at it is that if I said to you there's £100 here, or $100 or 100 euros, they're all the same, aren't they? They're all a currency and they're all 100, but they all buy you different things. And that's exactly the same. That's why you can't count calories, because calories from different foods do different things inside your body. While it's true that calories inside them, all the meters and all the test tubes, remember what a calorie is. A calorie is just a measure of energy and of heat. Yes, in a test tube, it might all be the same, but we don't really care what goes on in a test tube, do we? We want to know what goes on inside the human body. And literally all those things around calories, they have hardly any relevance at all to how your body utilizes energy from the food that you're eating. This is why, and I'll say it again, probably for the last time, counting calories does not work. Let's just remind ourselves again, I'm sorry I'm going over and over the same thing, but it's so important. All the food you eat breaks down into fat, protein and carbs, and while protein and carbohydrates are fairly straightforward to understand, fat's a little bit more complex. We'll come on to all of these in big detail in a minute. Let me just recap that your body must source fats, good quality wholesome fats. You can't survive without fat. You can't survive without protein, but you absolutely don't need any carbohydrates whatsoever. And I'll give you loads of examples throughout the course, like the Inuits, and all sorts of people, you know, the Eskimos who never see a carbohydrate can live a very long time without them. But I'm digressing a little bit here. What we're going to talk about now, I want to break down those three and give you just a little bit of a better understanding about them. The proteins and the carbohydrates, they're quite easy to understand. The fats are a little bit more complicated. So let me start with fats, because you know, you still see aisles and aisles of low fat, no fat goods, and they are completely, as far as I'm concerned, missing the point. Because when you take fat out, you have to put something in. I think some of the most dangerous, unhealthy food is all that low fat, no fat alternatives, that rubbish that we see filling supermarket shelves. Anyway, let's go back to fat. So much confusion around fat. People talk about, is it saturated fat? Is it polyunsaturated fat? Is it monounsaturated fat? The good news is this: you don't have to understand any of that. It's a total red herring. What is important when it comes to fat is simply this: is it real fat? As in, is it fat from an animal? Is it fat from an avocado or coconut? Or is it a manufactured, man-made fat? Because natural fats from nature, whether that be from the olive oil, whether that be from something that's natural, they're healthy. It doesn't matter whether it's polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, full saturated fats, all irrelevant. What is totally important, what you're going to learn throughout the reset, when it comes to fat, the only question you need to know, is it a natural fat or has it been messed with by man? Moving forward, good quality fats, rather than being the villain, you're going to treat as your best friend. Fats don't make you fat. They never have done. It's carbohydrates, and to a far lesser degree, if you had too much protein, that could cause you to pile on the weight, but never fat. I remember how growing up, I'd always cut the fat off the beef, the lamb, the chicken, the duck, in a belief that it was the fat that was making me fat, when in reality, leaving the fat on me would have helped me drop it from my waistline. Quality fats, they correct your hormones and they keep them in balance so that you feel more energetic. Quality fats actually help you burn more energy, not store it as body fat. Quality fats make you feel full so that you actually stop overeating earlier. And more importantly, quality fats reduce the likelihood of you falling victim to 6 out of 10 of the most common causes of serious illness and death in Great Britain. So where do we get quality fats from? Well, sources of good quality fat include anything rich in omega-3, such as salmon, nuts, avocado, coconuts, olives, lambs, organic butter. The key thing is anything that is natural. Deadly fats to avoid are fats in processed and packaged foods and vegetable oils, which, believe it or not, are rarely derived from vegetables. I just need to say that again because everybody thinks vegetable oil is a healthy oil. Vegetable oils are dangerous and they don't come from vegetables. You'll hear more about that later on. In principle, all fats are incredibly healthy as long as they are real fats and not manufactured fake fats, which can sadly be very toxic and dangerous. The health concern shouldn't be whether it's, like I say, saturated or polyunsaturated or monounsaturated. It simply has to be, is that fat real or is it manufactured? Now let's turn our attention to the other macronutrient, and that is protein. Now protein is the basic building block of life. Its name derived from the Greek word proteus, meaning primary or first. And protein is the driving force of change within your body. It comes to your aid when you need repairing. It rebuilds many of your organs, your body tissue, and your muscles. It is responsible for growth in the young. And it is the creator of all of your hormones, those hormones that we keep talking about. Now, protein is made up of what we call amino acids, and there are 22 different types of amino acid. Your body can actually produce most of them. It can create them, it can synthesize them. But there are 9 specific amino acids, 9 specific proteins that your body, nor my body, can actually create. And therefore, we have to consume them. If we don't consume these what we call essential amino acids, then eventually we become chronically ill. That was it really on protein. We may talk about it a little bit later throughout the course, but certainly when we start looking at recipes and the foods you should be eating. We've talked about fat, we've talked about protein. Now let's get on to the controversial subject of carbohydrates, aka sugar. During this reset, in addition to carefully dodging the poisonous oils, your new dietary enemy is going to become sugar and processed carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are almost exclusively derived from plants, well, plus a few dairy products. And they're not found in meat, fish, or poultry. Throughout this course, you're going to hear me talk about carbohydrates, but from now on, I'm going to abbreviate it to the word carbs. And the reason I do that is because I want you to see carbs for what they are with a very apt acronym. Carbohydrates are really bad sugars. What do I mean by this? Well, basically, carbohydrates are just sugar in disguise. Potatoes, pasta, bread, cereals and rice all convert to sugar inside your body. And when it enters your bloodstream, if it's not used there and then for energy, sugar in your bloodstream is poisonous. Sugars might be dressed up in fancy packaging and often carry labels that are misleading, sometimes with health benefits on the side. But you need to realize this from now on in. You were never designed, the human race was never designed to consume sugar all year round. Whether they are simple or complex, all carbs eventually turn into sugar in your body. The complex ones just take a little bit longer. Every time you eat carbs, complex or not, you're eating sugar. And too much carbs, too much sugar is what makes you fat. And will eventually, if you keep on the road you're on now, if you're eating that pasta, that rice, that bread too much, eventually it's going to lead to a whole host of problems and illness. And why do I say that? And I'm not trying to frighten you in any way, shape or form at all. Why do I say that? Because the statistics say so. And if you're already overweight, which I think you are because you're on this program, I'm promising you, it is not the fat that made you fat. It is not the protein that made you fat. It is too much carbs, in particular, the processed carbs. Let me now explain what I call the carbo coaster. Now, with the exception of fiber, and fiber, by the way, is a carbohydrate. It's a little bit complex. We'll talk about that later. Fiber is probably the exception to the rule. So with the exception of fiber, all the carbs you eat are easily converted to sugar inside your body. And sugar in your bloodstream is dangerous. So what happens next is the pancreas releases a hormone called insulin. And insulin grabs that sugar and pushes it down into your fat store. It stores your sugar. Now that can happen so quickly that shortly after a carb-loaded meal, you feel hungry straight again, really quickly. And that's what I mean by the carbo coaster. You eat the food, the sugar, insulin comes along because it's dangerous. It grabs it, it pushes it into your food stores so quickly that immediately or very shortly after, you're hungry again. The carbo coaster is really, really interesting. If you're a business person, I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. You ever wondered why they give you bread in many posh restaurants free of charge at the beginning of a meal? Let me tell you why. And that is, research has proven time and time again that if you consume bread at the beginning of a meal, you end up eating more courses. You end up spending more money in the restaurant, not because you feel obliged to because you had the free bread. No, nothing to do with that. They've realized that by putting bread out first and then spacing a little while for the starters to come along, you get onto the carbo coaster. You eat the bread, sugar comes along, which turns into sugar, insulin comes along, it grabs it and stores it as body fat so quickly you're even more hungry after you've eaten the bread than when you first walked into the restaurant. Now, there is no proteino coaster. There is no fatto coaster. The only coaster there is the carbo coaster. Eating too many carbs, whether that be bread, pasta or rice, because of your hormone insulin is there to get rid of that food, leaves you more hungry than you were before. And that's why you have to eat so many carbs. That's why you keep going back for the next Pringle. That's why you keep putting the next spoon of rice in the mouth, because of the carbo coaster. Now, it's all right me saying that. I'm not a doctor, as you know, but I've got some really impressive friends that are doctors. And here is one now, the brilliant Dr. Unwin, talking about the carbo coaster.
Your blood glucose goes up, but then insulin piles in, and the glucose is rapidly got rid of, pushed into your belly fat, into your muscles and into your liver, and then you're hungry again. And which of us have come home from a Chinese banquet and you could just really fancy a kebab, or you want something else from the fridge? And that is this phenomenon which of carbohydrates seem to drive appetite. Yeah, it drives appetite because they break down into glucose, the blood glucose goes up, insulin piles in, drives the blood glucose low, and you're hungry, and you go back to the cookie jar. And you could see how you'd end up on an endless cycle and wake up weighing 20 stone. And in fact, for years, that's how I was. I was constantly hungry, and my personal problem was biscuits. And I kept biscuits in the drawer of the consulting room, and if I was stressed, I'd have maybe 3 or 4 biscuits, but that would go on all day long. And I was using the biscuits as a kind of crutch, because I don't know, it seemed to help me, but I was actually addicted to them. And you just end up with a big belly and hungry all the time, and you don't ever count those biscuits. If somebody had said, did I eat many biscuits, I'd have said a few, but actually it was packets and packets and packets.
Carbs and other sugars work on the brain exactly in the same way as cigarettes. You get a craving and you eat a packet of crisps, mints or a donut or 2. It satisfies you for a short while, but not for long. And before you know it, you want more. 1 biscuit becomes 2 biscuits, becomes 3 biscuits, and so on. Carbs are addictive, and just like cigarettes, they have the power to cause chronic illness. Now, you're going to come across a phrase, metabolic syndrome, several times during this course. It is a phrase that is used a lot in medical circles today, and it's relating to the fact that most chronic illnesses we face in Great Britain, including cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, stroke, obesity, and many more, can all in part be related to the release of too much insulin. This modern sort of onslaught of insulin is caused by one thing and one thing only: the consumption of too many carbohydrates. Now, when we want to lose weight, different authors, different experts, different doctors all offer varying advice on how many carbohydrates you should consume. Some will say something like 70 grams, some 100 grams, some very specific like 73 grams. But the reality is this: your body actually needs 0 carbohydrates to survive. And put simply, the fewer carbohydrates you can eat, the quicker you'll both lose your weight and regain your metabolic health. When you get down to your ideal weight, if you want to have a couple of apples or a couple of bananas, then go for it. You know, you won't want the bread, because once you start living without it, you actually become as adverse to bread as if you would, I don't know, like to eat a dead rat if you want. And that might sound a bit strange right now at the very, very beginning of this course, but trust me, once you start living without bread, you're never going to want to go back. If in the future you start to eat too many carbohydrates, let's say you start eating so many apples and bananas, which are, after all, nature's candy, and let's say your weight was to start to slowly come back on, you know what? It's dead simple. You just cut them down again. It really is that straightforward. Okay, let's move on. I wanted to set this out today because you're going to hear a lot about the macronutrients. You're also going to find friends coming to you and asking you how you're getting on the course. And when you say to them, well, you know what, you could survive without any carbohydrates, they're going to turn around and say, well, that's absolute nonsense. They're going to say to you, you have to have a balanced diet, and they're going to say to you things like, well, you have to have some carbohydrates. Well, you've just learned you don't have to. You don't have to have any. And you just learned that it is not the fat or the protein that makes you put on that weight. It is just the carbohydrates. Okay, let's move on. I just wanted to set this out on day 2 because you're going to get lots of your friends trying to tell you that your new way of regaining your health is different to what they've been told about carbs. And importantly, they're going to say things to you like, well, everything in moderation, or have a balanced diet. In fact, the balanced diet one really annoys me. I own a supplement company, and we still have to write legally on the packaging that supplements work alongside a balanced diet. But why would you want to balance good with bad? Why not just cut down the carbohydrates and have more quality fats and more proteins? Why not just minimize those carbs to those found in green vegetables and fruit when it's in season? Other than those, the rest, the bread, the pasta, the rice and the potatoes, the packaged food, that's what's made you fat. But right now, and I don't mean that, by the way, that's what's made you fat. I mean, it's not your fault. You're here on this program to lose weight. It's not your fault you put on the weight. You've been given wrong advice. Your brain has been doing what it's supposed to, which is eat food. That's what you're wired to do. It's not your fault you're overweight. But it's important that you understand that it was just that one macronutrient that's caused the problem. But right now, I know that the thought of not eating some of those things like bread might sound a bit scary, but by the end of this reset, you will have learned a whole new way of eating that I promise you will absolutely love. Tasty, nutritional food that once you've regained control of your taste buds, your happiness with food, your enjoyment for life, your enjoyment of eating will skyrocket to a level that you can't even comprehend right now. Right, let's get on to the last of topics today. If you want to have a little pause now, it's going to be a totally different topic. Have a little pause, maybe come back later. But if you're ready, let's rock and roll. I want to talk to you now about the difference between happiness and pleasure. Now, while they seem similar and are often described as the same thing, they're actually polar opposites and pull in different directions. As Robert Lustig says, and he's the author of a brilliant book called The Hacking of the American Mind. I mean, it could be the hacking of the UK mind. It really means anybody that lives in modern society, how we've been hacked by the big food industries. As he says, pleasure is the slippery slope to tolerance and addiction, while happiness is the key to a long life. But if we don't understand what actually happens inside our brain, we become prey to industries that capitalize on our addiction in the name of selling one thing, and that is happiness. Now, happiness and pleasure aren't mutually exclusive, and when they combine together, that is sheer bliss. Like a healthy meal shared with really good friends, well, that can give you both pleasure and happiness. Now, I'm going to recommend that once you've finished the research, one of the first books you read is, in fact, this book. I've put a whole section at the back of the journal with all further reading, but promise me this, you must not read any of them until you've completed the reset. Please trust me on this. I mean, I know you're going to be eager to read and do as many different things as you can, but please trust me on this. We need to laser focus in on what we're doing for the next 7 weeks. But once you've completed your reset, then go out, and once that weight starts to drop and you're all excited, by all means, go back to the journal at the back and look at all the books that all my guests have written and some other books I've put in there, and they will help you further your journey and help you further keep that weight coming off and keeping it off for good. But here is Dr. Robert Lustig to explain the difference.
Today, 4.4% of the entire world has been diagnosed with clinical depression. That's a 20% increase in a decade.
That's fine.
The question is, where does this come from? And, what are we going to do about it? My thesis in the book, and the reason I wrote the book, is because I believe that we as a society have lost track of these two positive emotions, pleasure and happiness. We think they're the same. We've been told they're the same. And I think we've been told they're the same by the people who want us to buy stuff to, quote, get happy, because they have something to sell. Hedonics sell. In fact, 4 out of the top 10 exports of the United States are hedonic substances: oil, corn, soy, sugar. So this is a gravy train. This is a juggernaut for the industries that are involved in selling them. And so they want us to buy them. So they tell us these things will make us happy. But pleasure and happiness are not the same. In fact, I would argue that they are diametrically opposite. They seem like they are related. They're both positive emotions. We like them both. So why should we care? Well, I'm going to give you 7 differences between pleasure and happiness that I outlined in the book, and then I'll explain to you why we should care. So, pleasure is short-lived, like a meal, for an hour and get over it. Happiness is long-lived, like for a lifetime. Pleasure is visceral, you feel it in your body. Happiness is ethereal, you feel it above the neck. Pleasure is taking, happiness is giving. Pleasure is experienced alone. Happiness is usually experienced in social groups. Pleasure is achievable with substances. Happiness is not achievable with substances, which of course is why those substances are there for us. The extremes of pleasure whether it be substances or behaviors. And like I said, substances could be nicotine, cocaine, tobacco, alcohol, street drugs, heroin, morphine, sugar, or behaviors, shopping, gambling, internet, social media, pornography. In the extreme, all of these lead to addiction. So there's an aholic after every one of those. Shopaholic, sexaholic, chocoholic, alcoholic, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no such thing as being addicted to too much happiness. And then finally, number 7, and the reason I wrote the book, pleasure is dopamine, happiness is serotonin. So 2 different neurotransmitters in the brain, 2 different sets of receptors, 2 different mechanisms of action, 2 different regulatory pathways. These are not the same, 2 different areas of the brain where they work in. So like, why do we care? Like, so what? They both feel good. And in fact, that's kind of what the public did, was say, so what? Well, I think it matters a lot. And I think that one of the reasons we're in this boat is because we lost track of this.
Now, dopamine and serotonin are like hormones, but technically they're not. They're actually something called a neurotransmitter in the brain. But to keep things simple as we go through the rest of the reset, just treat them as hormones. They are biochemicals made in the brain that drive our feelings and emotions. But the two, dopamine and serotonin, are very different indeed. Now, don't get me wrong, pleasure, dopamine, isn't all bad. Without it, there'd be no human race because there'd be no sex drive. And in fact, with no pleasure, life itself can be really, really boring. In fact, with no pleasure, there's actually no happiness. Dr. Robert Lustig, in fact, Professor Robert Lustig, describes it as pleasure is the straw that stirs the drink of happiness. Robert Lustig goes on to tell us that although dopamine and serotonin drive separate brain processes, it's where they overlap and how they influence each other that generate action. The 2 separate chemicals in the brain travel along separate, what we call pathways, separate systems. And these separate brain waves and these separate systems do different things within the brain. And if we can get them to merge, well, that is where we really do have what we call the bliss point. Now, don't worry if all this right now sounds a bit technical, and you go, well, and maybe you're thinking, well, actually that's all a load of baloney because happiness and pleasure are the same thing. Well, hopefully I've shown that they're not, but if you still don't get it, don't worry, because even if you do a Google search, they confuse everything. You'll see pleasure and happiness interwoven even in dictionaries. And I believe the modern world, the world that you and I live in, experiences more and more pleasure these days, but less and less happiness. Now, here's a really important point. Marketing techniques from those huge 10 big food companies actually steer you and I away from happiness and towards pleasure. But sneakily, they tell us they're selling happiness. Have you ever noticed how the big food and fizzy pop corporations are always trying to tell us happiness, happiness, happiness? They all realize that happiness is the ultimate goal. Happy meals, happy hours, and Coca-Cola's long-running advert, Open Happiness. That advert ran for like 7 years. And they all promise to deliver the holy grail of life, don't they? McDonald's actually delivers a double whammy of happiness. Firstly, they tell you happy meals, then they tell you, I'm loving it. But the reality is, what they're really selling is short-term pleasure, short-term reward. And the reality is that if we consume too much of their happiness produce, the long-term effect on our health isn't happiness, but a life of misery. You see, you can't make profits out of selling happiness, but you can make billions and billions of pounds out of selling pleasure. Our pursuit of rewards and how the food industry and others encourage us to try and achieve those rewards, their constant peddling of pleasure, 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 is what has driven to a huge extent the chronic diseases that we face in our country. Diabetes, cancer, obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and dementia, all in a long part can be down to the fact that we're seeking so much pleasure. Now, a lot of what we'll focus on during the next 7 weeks, without sometimes you even noticing it, and hopefully you won't notice it, is that I'm going to be trying to tame your dopamine receptors. I'm trying to increase your happiness receptors, your serotonin receptors, and the production of even more serotonin. And that is why on day one, I said I will not only help you decrease your weight, but I'm also going to help you increase your happiness. And remember, I even made that as a promise to you. Are you eating that pizza tonight for happiness or pleasure? Now, if you were going to have a pizza tonight, I still want you to have it, because remember, this part of the program, we're rewiring the brain. You're committing down onto paper what it cost you to eat what you're currently eating. So you've got to eat it anyway. So let me say right now, how have big companies with their billions spent on research slowly been brainwashing you? See, they figured out long ago that the ultimate goal us humans seek is happiness. However, knowing that they only sold pleasure, addictive pleasure, they made us believe the two were the same thing, that they were interchangeable. They don't sell us pleasure meals or reward meals or addictive meals, but they call them happy meals. We aren't craving it, we're loving it. And of course, love is not pleasure, it's happiness. And they know that you can have too much pleasure. So instead, they pretend they're selling us happiness, which you can never have too much of. They also know that creating pleasure is now very cheap. So if you're overweight, especially if you're a lot overweight, you already have a huge dopamine problem. Then, as we'll learn tomorrow moving forward, when you see an advert that we'll call a cue, your dopamine level's going to go nuts, and your reward system, your demand system will just absolutely demand to be fed. If your hormone leptin, which is the one that tells you your full is working properly, then you might be able to fight off the adverts from the big companies that trigger your dopamine. But if you're overweight, you most likely currently have developed what I call leptin resistance, and therefore it can't fight back. Dopamine wins and wants to win over and over again. One donut becomes two, one glass of wine becomes two, then three, then more. The one biscuit becomes two, then three, then more, maybe the whole packet. And as we discussed earlier, you're hardwired to keep eating, especially carbohydrates and sugar. Now, habits, which we're going to discuss tomorrow, are a dopamine-driven feedback system. It is released not just when you experience the pleasure, but even when you anticipate it or even think about it. If you're a gambler, your dopamine rises before you even roll that first dice. As soon as your dopamine levels start to rise, you're motivated to take action. It is the thought, the anticipation of the reward that makes us take action. It's not actually the event, the fulfillment. Your brain has more pathways for wanting the reward than actually the liking of the reward. Think about food, think about Christmas, thinking about sex, thinking about holidays. It's normally better than the actual event. And what's interesting is that there's a far larger part of your brain, more neurons, more pathways, dedicated to triggering you into action than for actually enjoying the experience. Let me say that again, because it's so crucial to understand if you're overweight. There is a bigger element of your brain, more pathways, more neurons, more percentage of your brain dedicated to triggering you into action than actually enjoying the experience. And researchers found that 100% of a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens is activated during desiring and wanting, yet only 10%, 1/10 of that structure is activated during the participation. With so much pressure trying to build your desire and wanting of things, which was necessary for survival, but is being played on by the big corporations, you can see the struggle that you're facing. This is why you need to completely interact with this course. We have now realized that the power of your primal caveman-like brain, your subconscious, is driving your food choices. And if I just stop for a second and have you think about this, why is it that only 10% of the brain is for the enjoying and 100% is for the craving and the wanting? And that comes back to that thing we talked about yesterday, which is survival. Your brain, when it saw that berry or that strawberry or that food, had to trigger you to go and get that food for survival, even though when you're actually enjoying it, it's much, much less. That's why thinking about sex, thinking about holidays, thinking about food, drinking, thinking about wine, the actual thinking about it that drives the behavior is bigger than the actual enjoyment. And that's what we're going to reprogram in coming weeks. Now, I know I've covered a lot today, and neurotransmitters and serotonin and dopamine and receptor sites, it's all quite complicated, I know, and hopefully I've given you an idea of it, but literally over the next few weeks we'll cover it in a lot more detail, and anything that you're a bit fuzzy about today and didn't quite understand, or maybe I didn't, and by the way, it's never a problem with the learning, it's always a problem with the teaching. So if there's anything today that you didn't quite understand, that's my fault and not your fault. But I'm sure if there are any grey areas by the end of this reset, as we dig deeper and deeper into all this stuff, it will all make sense. And remember, and you've done brilliant, by the way, those were 2 super, super long days that you've just endured. The days will get shorter, I promise you. But what have I tried to do so far? I've tried to lay the foundations, and laying those foundations, if you ever drive past a building site, and we've just had a big Amazon warehouse built near us, for months I'd drive past and nothing went on. And last week I drove past and the building was there. Building foundations takes a long time, and that's what we're doing this week and next week before we even start looking at you changing your food. I want you to carry on eating what you've been eating up till now, but start to have these conversations in your own brain and start to feel different emotions. But lots more on that tomorrow. Today, hopefully you enjoyed the bit about the history. We got a basic understanding about the different foods, the fats, the proteins, and the carbohydrates. And back to the history, we discovered that all the way up to the 1950s, it was known that carbohydrates made you fat. It was only when the Ancel Keys came along that all of a sudden everything got messed up, and then we changed the government guidelines, and now the government don't want to do a U-turn. They've got so much resting on it, and all the food industry is around there that we're a little bit screwed up on what we're advising. And of course then we've just been on to talk about happiness and pleasure, which you're going to discover a lot more about in the coming weeks. Now, before you go, one last thing. Remember, I don't want you at the moment to change anything that you eat. I know you're probably desperate to want to change things, because that's why you're on this program. I know you're desperate to get into those jeans or to jump on the scales and see the weight come down. But I promise you this method works. At the moment, I don't want you to change anything, because you can't change that relationship with food until you have the learnings over the next few days. Have a great day, and I'll see you again tomorrow.